much. Hi, everyone. My name is Paolo Ruffino. Thank you, Miguel, for organizing and for inviting me here. In this presentation, I'm going to share some comments and thoughts about something I've been working on for a while. It's mostly a sort of reflection on the methodological implications that are involved in the study of video games in relation with the Anthropocene. And obviously implicated in this relation between something extremely small, such as the experience of playing a video game, and something nearly infinitely large, such as the Anthropocene, something that exceeds in time and space the perception of any one of us. There is, I think, very much implied here a question of scalability. So how can we move from the very large to the very small, and vice versa? And what happens as we move up and down? And what are the, let's say, the implications of this move? So just to give you a quick summary of what I'm going to talk about, and I'll try to stick in the time frame. So I'm going to just quickly sort of mention some examples from media studies, mostly, that are addressing similar questions in relation to cinema and television and the Anthropocene. But very rapidly, I'm going to then move into a sort of analysis of what I think are two of the dominant tendencies in game design and game studies. Will illustrate these two approaches, which I call the instrumental and representational. These are very much oversimplifications of something much more complex, but I'm going to use them strategically, in a sense, to illustrate my argument. And then I'm going to talk more about this idea of foregrounding the idea of scalability. I'm going to here bring some theories on hyperobjects and on scalability, over-interpretations from semiotics, and I'm also going to propose something on this idea of microdata, which is a sort of approach that I'm using. I'm going to then conclude with some case studies from research, which I think kind of resonates with what I'm discussing here today. So obviously, I don't think I need to introduce you to the Anthropocene, but just for the sake of this talk, I talk about the Anthropocene as a sort of general concept that comprises many different effects, such as climate change, 6 mass extinction of life, that sort of follow from the impact of human beings on planet Earth. And in media studies, there have been many attempts to try to evaluate how media texts are now engaging with the notion of the Anthropocene. And I think a particularly valuable approach here is what, for instance, Mark Bold and others propose in the book here, the Anthropocene Unconscious, which is to read media texts not just for the ways in which they represent climate change, for instance, or the Anthropocene, but for the ways in which they, the Anthropocene almost appears to leak, to drop into texts that are not necessarily about climate catastrophe or the apocalypse or the post-apocalypse and so on. In the work of Mark Bold, for instance, he looks at movies such as Fast and Furious or Sharknado or Pacific Rim by Guillermo del Toro, and looks at how some of our preoccupations and concerns about the Anthropocene appear in this text. So what about video games? So in what ways can we look at video games as texts that tell us something about the Anthropocene? There have been many attempts, obviously, in game studies. I'm just going to mention one among many, which I think is one of the most, substantial, and also has been influential for good reasons. Alenda Chang's work in the book Playing Nature. In particular, I want to focus here on something that Alenda Chang proposes in her book, which is to use this sort of metaphor of the mesocosm, which is borrowed from science, natural science, and it's the idea that essentially we can recreate natural environments in controlled settings and use that to experiment or to try different things and see how the environment react or might react. And her proposal is to look at video games through a similar lens. So video games can work as mesocosms, where we can sort of experiment with ideas, see how something might generate certain scenarios and how the world will react. In general, I think in game design in particular, there are two dominant approaches here which appearing sometimes overlapping and sometimes difficult to locate. But let's say for the sake here of this argument, one approach is to create games that are somehow instrumental for addressing at least the effects of climate change and the Anthropocene. So games that try to inform, for instance, and inform their players, educate their players, tell them something about the state of the art of technology, bringing some games I really like, such as Small Industria, Green New Deal Simulator, or even Decarbonize by Charles Games, but there are many around that try to sort of show the player what can be done, what has been done, what are the different options, and sort of educating, in a sense, their audience. The other approach relies more on the representation. So the idea is that by representing nature in new and different ways, through different perspectives, for instance, the audience, the players might change awareness or change their perception on how to engage with nature, how to engage with the world surrounding them. The works of David O'Reilly, for instance, I think are good examples. Now, what I think is, and both approaches, I think they're very good and they can be very useful in many ways. But what I want to propose here is that there is something here in the sort of rhetorical strategies of these games that needs to be addressed. And it is a sort of reliance on the scalability of the message of this text. So the idea is essentially that the message of the text will reach their audience and that will sort of scale up, let's say. It's going to inspire virtuous behaviors and possibly this will be communicated to others. So from the event, let's say, of the engagement of a player with a video game, there is a sort of transmission of knowledge that generates something more. And this scaling up, it is sort of assumed in a sense. It is something that the texts rely on, and at the same time, this strategy is sort of hidden or withdrawn, because it is something quite difficult to evaluate, to locate, or to take into account. And the notion of scale is quite important here because it is something that we can use to think about how we relate to something much bigger than us, such as the Anthropocene. In Minimal Ethics for the Anthropocene by Joanna Zielinska, she starts precisely by addressing this problem. The notion of scale, which can mean different things. In English, it could be something that we use to measure the weight of something, but can also mean a measurement system. But Zielinska reminds us it derives from the Latin scala, which means ladder. This is something we use to move up and down. And as we move up and down, we see the world from different perspectives, from the very high, from the very bottom, somewhere in the middle. But at the same time, we cannot hide the presence of the measurement tool. The notion of scale cannot be seen as an external measuring stick that can be objectively applied to time and space, but it's rather part of the phenomena it attempts to measure. So how can we take into account the presence of this ladder, so to speak, as we play a game and we try to imagine how we can move from what we are learning as we play a game and the infinitely large problem of the Anthropocene. So let me introduce you to this sort of hypothetical scenario, okay? Just to illustrate how this notion of scalability might actually enter our everyday experience, okay? So let's imagine that this is happening in, oh, sorry, I didn't switch. Oh, here we go. So this is happening in Copenhagen, okay? And this is, it's January. Okay, so January in Copenhagen, usually it's snowy, it's very cold. It's an unusually warm and sunny day in January in Copenhagen. And this lady just meets a stranger who, passing by, makes a comment about the weather, something like, oh, it's a very funny weather today, huh? And suddenly, this sort of neutral small talk about the weather becomes something a bit heavier and charged with more implications. Is this guy maybe trying to make a statement about, the fact that climate change is a hoax, that it's a conspiracy? Are they trying to maybe tell me that they vote for Donald Trump? Or is there something here bigger, let's say, than a simple comment on the weather? I borrowed this example from Timothy Morton, who uses this precise story to, not set in Copenhagen, but kind of similar, to illustrate this theory of the hyperobject. So in Timothy Morton's work, he considers the Anthropocene as a hyperobject, an object so large in time and space that exceeds the perception of any one of us individually. Obviously, no one of us is ever going to experience the totality of the effects of the presence of human beings on planet Earth. But what Morton argues is that we occasionally bump into the Anthropocene. We sort of encounter it, sometimes even in moments when we don't necessarily intend to meet the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene might appear in these random conversations where suddenly a comment about the weather becomes perhaps something or a comment about something much larger. In the theory of Timothy Morton, hyperobjects are viscous, are things that almost stick to us, like honey, he says, like something that kind of sticks to our experience and perception and remains in our memory for longer. They are non-local. They happen everywhere at once. They are not located at any specific place at any one moment. And they are phased, meaning that we only see some snapshots of it. We only see some very minimal fractions. In a similar way as what, for instance, Mark Bold argues when we encounter, let's say, some leakages of the Anthropocene when we watch Sharknado or Fast and Furious. I also borrow from the work of Anna Tsing, who, from a very different perspective, still brings the notion of scalability and non-scalability to the foreground when discussing about the impact of capitalism on our world. Tsing is particularly attentive to the trend in contemporary science to sum up. The idea of summing up is considered, as Anna Tsing argues, the hallmark of modern knowledge. And then she argues, what about those occasions where it becomes impossible to sum things up? And the example that she brings in her work in the book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, is the story of the Matsutake mushroom, which is a mushroom which is impossible to cultivate. It resists scalability in the sense that it resists the possibility of being farmed and cultivated, and can only be found through encounters, it's only knowable through the relational encounter with the mushroom. You cannot possibly know exactly where to find it. You can only sort of bump into it a bit randomly. And the story of the Matsutake mushroom, its value and its associations and connotations changes quite radically in different parts of the world. It's a mushroom that exists only relationally as it feeds and is fed by other forms of life. So it doesn't exactly exist in one place. Cannot be isolated. It cannot be scaled up and down without changing radically its very conditions of existence. So the question is, what if we foreground, let's say, the notion of scale in our understanding of the relation between video games and the Anthropocene? So if we do sort of borrow, in a sense, this attentiveness towards the presence of the ladder, the presence of the measuring stick in our evaluation of the relation between these two. In my work, for instance, I've been trying to use this approach, which I've called the analysis of microdata, sort of a pun, if you like, on big data. Now everyone has been obsessed with big data in contemporary academia. Big data is obviously interested in evaluating patterns, right? So seeing how data can potentially reveal truths by identifying patterns on large sets of data. So my idea is to sort of do the opposite, in a sense, to focus on those minimal extemporaneous texts, such as commentaries, for instance, produced by players and game makers, that constitute a sort of precarious formation of situated knowledge that resist scalability. They're not intending to scale up or to elevate or to become something more than what they are, but somehow reveal a potential interpretation or over-interpretation of a video game that suddenly connects it with something infinitely larger, such as the Anthropocene. And obviously, similar strategies have been largely used in the arts and humanities. I'm just borrowing here just one notion by Umberto Eco, the idea of over-interpretations, which I think is particularly useful. What is an over-interpretation? It's a sort of semiotic strategy that overreads a text, that opens a text to the point where the text says much more than what you really intended to say. The intentio operis, the intention of the work is moving to completely other directions. An example of overinterpretation is, for instance, the reading of a conspiracy theorist. All right, so if you think about chemtrails, the conspiracy theory that the chemical trails left by aeroplanes are actually spreading toxics on the population. So there is nothing in those trails that suggests that there is a global conspiracy against all of us. So there is an overreading, let's say, of those signs. But what Eco here tells us is that these cases of overinterpretation, they don't really tell us much about the text, but they do tell us something about the reader. So someone who believes in the chemtrails conspiracy, maybe we don't read this conspiracy to learn something about the physics of airplanes, but we can learn something about what this person thinks of the world in which we live and why they decide to come up with this sort of overinterpretations. All right, so how can this approach appear, let's say, in the study of video games? So I've been experimenting, let's say, with this method. Actually, the theorization actually came after trying things out. But just to mention an example, I've been playing a lot this video game, Adventure Capitalist. It's a smartphone game. It's an idle incremental game, right? So it's one of those games where what you have to do is simply to start the game, and then you can leave it there. You then return to it maybe years, months later, only to find out that the game has accumulated points. In this case, this is a representation of capitalism itself. You start with a lemonade stand, you can reach the oil company, but the point is simply that you can essentially you keep accumulating wealth, and the game will do the work for you in a sense. Now, the thing about this game is that it doesn't have an end. There is no ending in this game. And what I found out actually that at some point in the official forum of this game, players started speculating about how to put an end to this game, because they spent years, they were obsessed and addicted with clicking on these buttons just to see the numbers going up and reaching these always new objectives that always look the same. And they really wanted to reach an end, but the game denied them of this end. And some of these strategies became particularly fantastical, let's say, or imaginary. Some of them became obvious cases of over-interpretations, where the strategy to find an end to venture capitalism became a discussion on how to find an end to capitalism and to the pleasures that capitalism gives us when presenting this imaginary of frictionless growth, the frictionless growth of wealth. Now, these comments rarely generated further responses. They were usually very isolated comments, just one new thread with one comment, no responses. And there were very few that really engage with capitalism, let's say. But those forum comments, they are definitely over-interpretations of the game, which never really suggest that there could be a political reading of this game. But they also reveal a transformative approach to the video game, which illustrate players' anxieties about an economic system that has failed to deliver on its promises, and a sort of anxiety about the world in which we live, where this capitalistic system generates both pleasures at the same time is destroying the world in which we live. I'll give you another example. Red Dead Redemption 2, and I think it's important here to notice that none of these games are about climate change specifically or about the Anthropocene, and that's precisely what I think it's interesting. So I'm not sure how many of you played Red Dead Redemption 2. I might spoiler the end here, but towards the end of the game, the main character, Arthur, who is this sort of white, able-bodied man, contracts tuberculosis. And all the possible endings of the game are the character is affected by tuberculosis. It was not curable at the time in which the game is set. The interesting thing about this game is that the players are never told how and where Arthur contracts tuberculosis. So the supposed control of this white male subject on the external world and the other non-player characters is suddenly lost. We no longer know the cause of the effect that we are seeing. And many players started, well, not many really, just a few, to be honest, maybe 20, 30 videos. That's all that there are on YouTube. They started creating videos about how to save Arthur, how to find a cure for Arthur, how to heal Arthur, knowing very well that there is no possibility to cure Arthur. These videos are played in this sort of contradictory position. So they acknowledge at some point that there is no possibility of saving Arthur, but they go actually quite in depth in the game to find a potential way to save Arthur from contracting tuberculosis. So again, the video game and the videos are not about the Anthropocene, but they are concerned with the loss of agency and control of the white man over his surrounding world, over his body, over his lungs. So there is an anxiety here about the loss of control that we assume to have in this world, particularly as white men, let's say, speaking as a white man. But these videos always also address in a sense, the unresolvable anxieties generated by the imaginary of a post-anthropocentric world. So players don't really know how to heal the wound that has been created here, and they just fantasize on how to sort of take back control on a world that is no longer under their control. Another example actually from the work of Lawrence May and Ben Hall, and there are many articles where these authors really, I think they use a similar methodology. They've been looking, for instance, at City Skyline, Animal Crossing, Battlefield. Again, none of these games are about the Anthropocene or climate change. But here the authors look at the players' paratextual production, so how the players have been creating paratext that reflect on their practice surrounding these games. And the authors pay attention to the not fully articulated desires of the player community for an eco-friendly world and their clash with the inescapable logic of capitalism. So what is interesting here is that the authors also focus on how they encounter these paratexts and how these paratexts generate feelings in them, how they communicate with them about their interpretation of the game. So these kind of readings are, again, very much about the situated encounter, what I think resists scalability, what happens in the moment in which players or the scholars encounter this particular kind of text, and now this encounter generates interpretations or over-interpretations about the Anthropocene. Yeah, so sorry, that's actually what I just said. Last but not least, I think the work of Benjamin Nicol is particularly brilliant here. In an article where he, from 2023, where he looks at the game Donut County. So the game is very difficult really to explain this game. You're essentially playing as a whole, and you have to swallow everything on the surface of the world, okay? So here the author, through drawing on psychoanalysis and psychoanalytical theory, reads this game in light of the current concerns for the destruction of the natural ecosystem. And Nicol presents again his own personal encounter with the game and reads the game as intersecting with the Anthropocene. Donut County enables a psychoanalytical reading of the pleasures and fears which are associated with self-destruction and self-consumption in a capitalist world. All right, so I'm not sure how much time I've left, but I'm concluding. So what I really want to highlight here, as I've already said, none of these games that I've mentioned so far represent the Anthropocene or climate change. None of these games are trying to fix the problem of climate change. They're not trying to educate their audiences. And I'm not saying that by doing this they are better or worse. I'm just saying that there is a different potential, let's say, an interpretative potential that can be opened up here in these cases. But we can still read them, let's say, as showing some leakages, some drops of the Anthropocene, of this viscous substance, as Timothy Morton says. And by foregrounding the notion of scale, we can attend to those minimal interpretations or over-interpretations of video games that bring to the fore the questions and the anxieties about the Anthropocene, which would otherwise remain invisible. So just to conclude with a very quick kind of self-promotion, if you like. So I've been working on this line of thought for a long time. There is an article on the Journal of Games Criticism that was published around 1 year ago that kind of presents what I discuss in a longer format, and there is also a book coming up where I mean, this is sort of part of the methodology of this book, which then goes on through different case studies. The book will be published by MIT later this year. So if you want to know more, let's say there are these two sources, and they're both open access. Okay, so I'm not asking for your money. Okay, so you can read them for free. All right, thank you so much. Thanks.